Right now, on a galaxy 2.5 million light-years away, an event is taking place. Or it already happened. Or it has not happened yet. According to the same physics that runs the GPS in your pocket, which of those is true can depend on how fast you are walking down the street. And that same physics asks a stranger question about you. Are you a single, whole self, moving through time one moment at a time? Or are you something else, a shape stretched across time, a four-dimensional object whose now is only one thin slice of a far larger thing? This is the physics of identity in a block universe. The idea, taken seriously by Albert Einstein, by Hermann Minkowski, by Rietdijk-Putnam, and by a century of thinkers after them, is that the past, the present, and the future may all exist together, and that you may not be a traveller through time at all, but a world line laid out across it, assembled from what philosophers call temporal parts. By the end, you will understand what relativity actually says about the word now. Why one simple thought experiment seems to prove the future already exists. What it would mean for yourself to be a stack of time slices instead of a soul. And where this elegant picture quietly runs out of answers. Hold on to one question as we go. If you are only a sequence of parts, who is it that experiences the whole? If you find value in explorations like this, in following the puzzles that keep physicists awake at night, consider subscribing to the channel, which helps these deep dives reach more curious minds. Now, let us begin. Begin with something you have never once doubted. You woke up this morning as the same person who went to sleep last night. The child in the oldest photograph in your house, the face in the mirror today, the older face that will look back at you decades from now. You assume, without argument, that these are all one thing, one self, whole and entire, carried forward through time like a passenger in a moving vehicle. The scenery changes, the passenger does not. This is perhaps the most basic belief a human being holds, more basic than belief in any fact about the outside world, because it is the belief in the one who holds all the other beliefs. And yet, when physics looked closely at time in the early 20th century, the moving passenger began to dissolve, not into mysticism, into geometry. The question this exploration asks is whether you are a single self that endures through time, or whether you are something the physics of relativity quietly suggests instead. An object extended through time, the way a road is extended through space, made of separate stretches, separate slices, what philosophers call temporal parts. To understand why serious people came to take that second picture seriously, we have to start where the trouble started, with the word now, and a discovery that the word does not mean what you think it means. In June of 1905, a 26-year-old patent clerk in Bern submitted a paper to the journal Annalen der Physik. It was received on the 30th of June and published on the 26th of September that year. Its title was modest, On the Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies. Its author was Albert Einstein, and the paper founded what we now call special relativity. The argument rested on two postulates of disarming simplicity. First, that the laws of physics are the same for every observer moving at a constant velocity. Second, that the speed of light in empty space is the same for every such observer, regardless of how fast the source or the observer is moving. That second postulate is the strange one. The speed of light in vacuum is exactly 299,792,458 meters per second, about 186,282 miles per second, or roughly 670 million miles per hour. In modern physics, that number is not measured anymore. It is fixed by definition. And the claim is that no matter how you chase a beam of light, no matter how fast you run after it, it always recedes from you at exactly that speed. You cannot gain on it. You cannot fall behind it. It is the same for everyone. Hold that fixed, and something has to give. What gives is time itself, and with it, the idea of a shared present. Consider what physicists call the relativity of simultaneity, because everything in this story flows from it. Picture a long train carriage moving smoothly down a track, and imagine a lamp at the exact center of the carriage that flicks on once. The light spreads outward in both directions. To a passenger sitting inside, the light reaches the front wall and the back wall at the same instant. The lamp is centered, the walls are equidistant, the light travels at a fixed speed, so the two arrivals are simultaneous. Now place an observer standing on the embankment outside, watching the train rush past. For that observer, during the tiny interval while the light is in flight, the back wall is rushing toward the point where the flash happened, and the front wall is racing away from it. The light, traveling at the same fixed speed for this observer too, therefore reaches the back wall first and the front wall a moment later. Two events: light hits the back, light hits the front. The passenger says they happened at the same time. The observer on the ground says one happened before the other. Neither is mistaken. Neither instrument is faulty. There is simply no fact of the matter, no privileged answer about whether two separated events are simultaneous. Simultaneity depends on your state of motion. Sit with that, because it is the hinge on which the entire question turns. The word now, when it reaches out to touch a distant event, does not pick out a single objective slice of reality that everyone shares. Your now, and the now of someone moving relative to you, slice through the events of the universe at slightly different angles. For events close to you and slow motions, the disagreement is far too small to notice. But the disagreement is real, and as we will see, it does not stay small when distances grow astronomical. This was the conceptual earthquake. The aftershock came 3 years later, and it came in the language of geometry. In 1908, the mathematician Hermann Minkowski delivered a lecture titled Space and Time, published the following year, in which he argued that space and time should no longer be treated as separate stages. They should be understood together as a single four-dimensional fabric. He opened with a now famous flourish, that henceforth space by itself and time by itself were doomed to fade into mere shadows, and only a union of the two would preserve an independent reality. In Minkowski's framework, an object is not a thing that sits in space and waits while time flows past. An object is a curve. Every particle, every atom, every person traces out a path through the 4 dimensions of space-time, 3 of space, 1 of time. And that path is called a world line. Your world line began at your birth and will end at your death. And at every point along it sits one momentary version of you. You at 3 years old. You reading this. You in your final hour. Minkowski's geometry treats all of those points as features of one curve in one fabric. It is worth pausing to be precise, because Einstein himself was careful here, and the carefulness matters for everything that follows. Reflecting in 1946, late in his life, Einstein called it a widespread error to think that relativity had newly introduced the 4-dimensional character of the world. Classical physics, too, used 4 numbers to label an event: 3 for where, 1 for when. What relativity changed was not the count of dimensions, it was the relationship between them. It removed the old absolute privilege of the time coordinate, the assumption that there exists one universal slicing of the fabric into all of space at this single moment. Keep this distinction in mind. Relativity did not invent the 4th dimension. It demoted the universal present. Whether that demotion proves anything about the soul or the self or free will is a question we are deliberately holding for later. Right now, we are only laying out what the physics says. What the physics says next is captured in a single equation, and it is worth stating because it is the mathematical heart of the block. When 2 observers disagree about distances and disagree about times, you might expect them to disagree about everything, and for the geometry to collapse into pure relativism. It does not. There is a quantity on which every observer, no matter their motion, agrees exactly. It is called the space-time interval. Written in the convention this exploration will use, it is s squared equals the quantity c times delta t squared minus delta x squared minus delta y squared minus delta z squared. In plain language, take the time between 2 events, multiply it by the speed of light, and square it. Then subtract the squares of the separations in each of the 3 directions of space. The number you are left with, s squared, the interval, is the same for every observer in uniform motion. One observer assigns more time and less space to a pair of events. Another assigns less time and more space. But the particular combination encoded in the interval comes out identical for both. Space and time trade against each other, but a deeper quantity is conserved. Think about what that means with an everyday image. Picture 2 surveyors mapping the same tower from 2 different angles. One stands to the north, one to the east. Ask each how far apart the tower's base and its tip are horizontally, and they give different answers, because each sees the tower foreshortened differently. Ask each for the straight line distance from base to tip, and they agree exactly. The horizontal and vertical shadows depend on where you stand. The true length does not. The space-time interval is the true length. Space separations and time separations are the shadows it casts, and different observers, moving differently, catch the shadow at different angles. What does it mean that the universe guards one invariant quantity while letting space and time themselves bend around it? At minimum, it means time is not the absolute freestanding background we instinctively take it to be. It is woven into the same fabric as space, and the weave is what is real. From this single fabric, two more ideas follow, and both will matter. The first is proper time. A clock does not measure some universal cosmic time. It measures the length of its own world line through space-time. The time a clock records as it travels from one event to another is called its proper time, and it is given by another equation. d tau equals dt times the square root of 1 minus v squared over c squared. Here, d tau is the proper time the moving clock actually experiences, dt is the time assigned in the frame we are measuring from, v is the clock's speed, and c is again the speed of light. The factor in that square root, and its inverse, written with the Greek letter gamma, governs the whole scale of relativistic effects. When v is small compared to light, gamma is almost exactly 1, and everyone's clocks nearly agree. As v climbs toward the speed of light, gamma swells without limit, and the moving clock's proper time falls further and further behind. The consequence is stark, and it is not a metaphor. Two clocks that begin together and follow different paths through space-time can read different elapsed times when they are brought back together. Time elapsed is not a fact about the universe as a whole. It is a fact about a path. How sharply time and length depend on motion is captured by a single quantity, the one that governs the entire scale of relativistic effects. It is called the Lorentz factor, written with the Greek letter gamma, and it is defined as gamma equals 1 divided by the square root of 1 minus v squared over c squared. Here, v is the relative speed and c is the speed of light. The behavior of that expression is the whole story in miniature. When v is small, the speeds of cars, of aircraft, even of rockets, v squared over c squared is a vanishingly tiny number. The square root is almost exactly 1, and gamma is almost exactly 1. Clocks and rulers barely shift, which is why no one detected any of this for the whole of human history before the 20th century. But as v climbs toward the speed of light, the quantity under the square root shrinks towards 0, and gamma climbs without bound. At about 87% of light speed, gamma is 2, and a moving clock runs at half rate. Nearer still, gamma soars toward the impossible. The factor carries the name of the Dutch physicist Hendrik Lorentz, who wrote down the transformation equations in 1904, 1 year before Einstein gave them their physical meaning. Those transformation equations deserve to be stated, because one of them is the precise engine of everything we have described. To convert the time of an event from one observer's frame to another's, relativity uses t prime equals gamma times the quantity t minus vx over c squared. Read that final term slowly, because it is the source of the entire strange business of simultaneity. The transformed time, t prime, does not depend only on the original time, t. It depends also on x, on where in space the event occurs, multiplied by the relative velocity and divided by the speed of light squared. Two events that share the same time t in one frame, but sit at different positions in space, are therefore assigned different times in another frame. That one term, minus Vx over c squared, is why moving observers disagree about which distant events happen at the same time. It is, more than any other line of mathematics, the equation beneath the block universe argument. Everything that will later sound like metaphysics traces back to that quiet term, mixing a little space into the measurement of time. And the transformations carry a spatial twin to time dilation called length contraction. An object in motion is measured by the observer it moves relative to as shortened along its direction of travel, again by the factor gamma. Space and time are not merely relabeled by motion, they are systematically traded, one stretching as the other shrinks, while the invariant interval holds firm beneath both. There is an image that makes the geometry of simultaneity almost tangible, and because it concerns only the neutral physics, it is safe to lean on it. Picture the whole of space-time, every event that ever happens everywhere, as a single enormous loaf of bread. To live through time is to slice the loaf. Each slice is a now, a complete snapshot of all of space at one instant. And a life is the experience of slice after slice, front to back through the loaf. Here is what relativity discovered. There is no single correct way to slice. An observer at rest cuts straight across, perpendicular to the loaf's length. An observer in motion cuts at a slight angle. The knife tilts, and there now passes through the loaf along a different plane. Both slice the same loaf. Both slices are equally valid. But because the cuts are tilted relative to one another, a single crumb deep inside the loaf, a distant event, can fall on this observer's slice of now and on that observer's slice of later. The loaf, the whole four-dimensional block, is identical for everyone. Only the angle of the knife differs. And once you picture the loaf as already baked, already whole, with slicing merely a way of reading what is there, you can feel the pull toward eternalism that so many physicists felt. Whether the loaf is truly baked all the way to its far end, or whether it is still rising at the edge we call the present, is the question the bread cannot answer, and one we will return to. Before we leave the mathematics for the laboratory, sit with one implication. If the angle of your slicing depends on your motion, and if every slice is as valid as every other, then the set of events you call happening now is, in a strict and measurable sense, yours, not the universe's. What does it mean that the present moment, the thing that feels most universal and most shared of all, turns out to be a private cut through a loaf that admits no privileged cut? Take a moment with that before we ask whether the loaf is finished or still baking. Here it becomes essential to be concrete, because everything said so far can sound like a philosopher's word game, and it is not. These effects have been measured in hardware with clocks you could carry in a crate. In October of 1971, two physicists, Joseph Hafele and Richard Keating, loaded portable cesium beam atomic clocks onto ordinary commercial airliners and flew them around the world, once heading east, once heading west, comparing them afterward to identical clocks left on the ground at the United States Naval Observatory. Relativity predicted that the flying clocks would fall out of step with the ground clocks by a few 100 billionths of a second, and that the eastward and westward trips would differ because of the way the Earth's own rotation combines with the motion. The clocks that flew east lost about 59 billionths of a second, with an uncertainty of 10. The clocks that flew west gained about 273 billionths of a second, with an uncertainty of 7. Both results matched the predictions. Time had, measurably, run at different rates for clocks that took different paths. 5 years later, in June of 1976, the principle was tested with far greater precision. A mission called Gravity Probe A launched a hydrogen maser clock nearly 10,000 kilometers up on a rocket and compared its ticking to a twin on the ground, confirming that clocks run faster where gravity is weaker, to an accuracy of about 0.02%. And every day, the same physics keeps you from getting lost. The satellites of the Global Positioning System carry atomic clocks in orbit, and those clocks do not keep the same time as clocks on the ground. Special relativity from their orbital speed makes them tick about 7 microseconds per day slow. The weaker gravity at their altitude makes them tick about 45 microseconds per day fast. The net effect is roughly 38 microseconds per day faster than clocks on Earth's surface. 38 millionths of a second sounds like nothing. But light travels about 11 kilometers, nearly 7 miles, in that time. And if the system did not correct for relativity continuously, your position would drift by miles within a day. Every time a navigation app quietly tells you where you are, it is paying a tax to Einstein and Minkowski. The geometry of spacetime is not a seminar room abstraction. It is engineering. What does it mean that time itself bends in proportion to motion and to gravity, and that we have built a global infrastructure that only works because we account for it? It means that the comfortable picture, one universal clock ticking off the same seconds for the whole cosmos, one shared now rolling forward together, is not the world we live in. The physics has retired it. The question is what to put in its place. And here the path forks into 3, and the names of the 3 forks matter, because the rest of this exploration lives among them. The first fork is called presentism. Presentism holds that only present things exist. The past is gone, real once, real no longer. The future is not yet. It will be real, but it is not real now. On this view, reality is a single thin sheet of now, constantly being remade, and nothing exists outside it. This is very close to the picture almost everyone carries around without ever naming it. The second fork is called eternalism. Eternalism holds that past, present, and future all exist, in the broad sense in which anything exists at all. On this view, the dinosaurs are not gone. They are simply elsewhere. Elsewhere in time, the way another continent is elsewhere in space. Your birth still exists, at its location in the fabric. Your death already exists, at its location. The whole of space-time is laid out, every event in its place, and now is merely where you happen to be reading from. The way here is merely where you happen to be standing. This is the picture often called the block universe. Reality as a single, finished, four-dimensional block, with time as one of its dimensions. The third fork is a compromise called the growing block theory. On this view, the past and the present are real, but the future is not yet. Reality is like a block that keeps growing, accreting new layers of existence at the advancing edge of the present, while the future remains genuinely open and unmade. Past, fixed and real. Future, not yet anything. Three pictures: presentism, eternalism, the growing block. Notice that physics by itself has not yet chosen among them in this account. What physics has established is narrower and firmer. There is no observer-independent universal slice of the present moment stretching across all of space. That fact sits uneasily with presentism, because presentism wants exactly such a universal present, one sheet of now that is all that exists. And relativity says no two observers in different states of motion will agree on which events fall on that sheet. That is why a great many physicists and philosophers have read relativity as leaning hard toward eternalism, toward the block. If there is no privileged now, perhaps there is no privileged present at all. Perhaps every event simply exists tenselessly at its own address in space-time. But notice the word leaning. Whether the geometry actually proves the block or merely permits it is one of the questions we are foreshadowing now, and will return to with full force later. For the moment, simply register the temptation, because it is powerful, and it is where the deeper claims will eventually be built. Keep this seed in mind. Removing a universal now is a statement about simultaneity. Concluding that the future already exists, in full, finished and fixed, is a larger statement. And the distance between those two is exactly where the argument will later be won or lost. There is one more piece of the physics to lay down before we turn to people, and it is the structure that gives the block its shape, the light cone. At any event, any single point in space-time, a here and now, Draw all the paths that light could take outward into the future and inward from the past. They form a cone, opening upward into the future and downward into the past, with the event at its waist. Everything inside the future cone is reachable from the event by something traveling at or below light speed. These are the events the present can influence. Everything inside the past cone could have influenced the event. These are called time-like related, and crucially, every observer agrees about them. The order of cause and effect is preserved for everyone. But everything outside the cone, to the sides, is what physicists call space-like separated. These are events so far away in space and so close in time that not even light could bridge the gap between them. And for those events, and only those, observers disagree about the order, about simultaneity, about which came first. The disagreement about now lives entirely in the region no signal can cross. This is not a limitation of our instruments. It is built into the causal structure of reality. For two space-like separated events, there is no possible signal, no possible influence, nothing traveling at or below the speed of light that could establish a shared present between them. Picture two lighthouses on opposite shores of an ocean so wide that no beam, no messenger, no signal of any kind could ever cross it within the time available. Each keeper can know his own coast in perfect detail. Neither can ever share a single synchronized instant with the other. Any now that tried to stretch across that gap would have to be something over and above what can be measured or signaled. Something added to the physics, not read off from it. What does it mean that the universe contains a hard physical barrier against ever confirming a single shared present across a distance? It means that any universal now you want to insist on must be defended on grounds beyond physics. The geometry will not hand it to you. That is the stage, fully set. A four-dimensional fabric, world lines threading through it, an invariant interval beneath the shifting shadows of space and time. Clocks that disagree because they take different paths, confirmed in aircraft and rockets and the satellites overhead. Three rival pictures of what is real: presentism, eternalism, the growing block, and a physics that has quietly dismantled the universal present that presentism needs. We have named the block universe, and we have named its temporal parts. But we have not yet asked the question that makes this more than cosmology. We have not yet asked what it does to you. If the universe is a block, and you are a world line within it, then which of the many momentary versions strung along that line is the real you? All of them? One of them? And what holds them together into a single life? That is where we turn next. And it is where the geometry of space-time collides with the oldest question a person can ask. What exactly am I? The question, what am I, is older than physics, and philosophers have a precise way of sharpening it. They call it the problem of persistence. In virtue of what is an object that exists at one time the very same object that exists at another? And there are two great families of answer. The first is called endurantism. To endure is to be wholly present at every moment at which you exist. On this view, you, the entire you, complete and undivided, are fully here right now. And you were fully there yesterday, and you will be fully there tomorrow. There are not parts of you parcelled out across time. There is one whole thing, persisting, present in its entirety at each instant. This is the view almost everyone holds the moment before they think about it. The cat on the mat, the child in the photograph, the adult in the chair. Each is literally one and the same thing, wholly there whenever it is there. The second family is called perdurantism. To perdure is to persist by having different temporal parts at different times. On this view, you are not wholly present at any single moment. What is present right now is only a part of you, a temporal part, a momentary slice, in the same way that only part of a road is present at any one milepost. The whole road is the entire stretch from origin to destination. The whole you is the entire stretch of your world line, from birth to death, and any given instant catches only a cross-section of it. Philosophers have a vivid name for this. They call it worm theory, because a persisting object on this picture stretches through time the way an earthworm stretches through space, a long, thin thing, most of which is never where you happen to be looking. You, at this moment, are one segment of the worm. You, yesterday, are another. The whole worm is the entire four-dimensional creature. There is a cousin of worm theory worth naming because it sharpens the strangeness. It is called stage theory. Worm theory says the real you is the whole worm, and the present slice is just a part of it. Stage theory says something more radical, that the real you is the stage, the momentary slice itself, and that the slices at other times are not parts of you, but counterparts of you, related to you, but not identical to you. On the stage view, the you of this instant is a complete but fleeting object, and you yesterday is a different object that this one is descended from. Either way, worm or stage, the four-dimensional ontology is the same. Reality is the block, and persons are patterns within it, made of temporal parts. Why would anyone abandon the comfortable, whole, enduring self for this? Not on a whim. The leading argument for temporal parts comes from a deep and genuine puzzle, one that has nothing to do with relativity and everything to do with ordinary change. Philosophers call it the problem of temporary intrinsics, and it was pressed hardest by the American philosopher David Lewis, who lived from 1941 to 2001, and whose essay Survival and Identity appeared in 1976. The puzzle is this. Suppose you sit and then you stand. Sitting and standing are intrinsic properties, properties you have in yourself, not in relation to anything else. But here is the difficulty. If one and the same wholly present thing is bent while sitting and straight while standing, then it has two incompatible intrinsic shapes. A single thing cannot be both bent and straight, full stop. So something has to give. One option is to say shape is not really intrinsic after all, that being bent is secretly a relation to a time, bent at noon, straight at 1. But that feels wrong. Your posture seems to be a fact about you, not a relation you bear to a clock. The pedurantist offers a clean escape. There is no single thing that is both bent and straight. There is a bent temporal part and a different straight temporal part, each with its own intrinsic shape, strung along your world line. The contradiction dissolves because the bearer of bent and the bearer of straight are not the same object. They are different parts of one worm. That is the argument's force, and it is real. But endurantists do not concede. They reply that the temporal part's solution wins only by changing the subject. It dissolves the contradiction, they say, by quietly replacing the everyday object, the person, whole and continuous, with a space-time aggregate of slices that no ordinary person ever took themselves to be. The everyday view has its own tools. It can treat properties as tensed, as had at a time. It can speak of being bent at one moment and straight at another as different ways of having a property rather than different parts having it. The debate over whether those tools work is genuinely unsettled, and it is worth being honest that it is unsettled. The point for us is not to declare a winner here in the neutral portion of our investigation. The point is to see clearly what the pedurantist is proposing, because when that proposal is turned from chairs and postures onto persons and souls, the stakes change entirely. A second puzzle reinforces the first, and it is concrete enough to picture exactly. Take a lump of clay. On Wednesday, you mold it into a statue. On the following Sunday, you crush it back into a shapeless lump. Now ask a simple question. How long did the statue exist, and how long did the lump exist? The lump existed for the whole week. The statue existed for 5 days. But if the statue and the lump are the very same object, how can one of them be older than the other? The same thing cannot have two different lifespans. The pedurantist has a tidy answer ready. The statue and the lump are two four-dimensional objects that share their temporal parts during those 5 days and diverge outside them. The statue is, in effect, a temporal part of the longer-lived lump. The puzzle of coincidence, two things in the same place at the same time, becomes the unremarkable fact that two worms overlap along part of their length. Again, present this neutrally. Whether it is the right account or a clever redescription is exactly what is at issue. But notice how naturally the four-dimensional picture absorbs a puzzle that ties the everyday view in knots. This way of thinking did not arrive overnight. Its roots run through the middle of the 20th century. The American philosopher and logician Willard Van Orman Quine, in his 1948 essay on What There Is, helped make respectable the idea of treating objects as four-dimensional. The British-Australian philosopher John Jameson Carswell Smart, in his 1949 paper The River of Time, became one of the earliest and clearest defenders of what is called the tenseless or B-theoretic view of time, the view that describes all of reality in terms of earlier than and later than relations, with no privileged moving present. And the contemporary capstone came in 2001, when the philosopher Theodore Sider published Four-Dimensionalism, an ontology of persistence and time, with Oxford University Press. It became the canonical modern defence, and Sider's thesis is stated without hedging. The material world is composed of temporal parts as well as spatial parts. Cut the world along space and you get objects side by side. Cut it along time and you get temporal parts, one after another. On this view, that is simply what objects are. Now push the four-dimensional picture into the place where it bites hardest. Not statues, but selves. And the sharpest instrument for that is a thought experiment philosophers call fission. Imagine, and the imagining is what does the work, not the surgery, that the two hemispheres of a person's brain could each be transplanted into a separate body, and that each resulting person woke up with the original's memories, character, intentions, the whole psychological fabric intact. Call them lefty and righty. Each is fully psychologically continuous with the original. Now ask, which one is the original person? It cannot be both, because one thing cannot be numerically identical with two distinct things. Lefty and righty are clearly two people. They will live different lives, see different rooms, never share a thought again. But there is no principled reason to say it is lefty rather than righty, or righty rather than lefty. The case is perfectly symmetric. So the original is neither, or the question has no good answer. Personal identity, the strict relation of being one and the same person, has broken in our hands. It was the English philosopher Derek Parfit, who lived from 1942 to 2017, who drew the most influential conclusion from cases like these. First in his 1971 paper, Personal Identity, then in his landmark 1984 book, Reasons and Persons. Parfit defended what is called a reductionist view of the self. On this view, the facts about a person consist in more particular facts. Facts about a brain, a body, and a long chain of interlocking psychological connections. Memories linking to experiences, intentions linking to actions, beliefs and desires carried forward and gradually edited. There is, Parfit argued, no further deep fact, no separately existing ego, no indivisible self over and above that chain. And then he drew the conclusion that gives this whole topic its unsettling edge. In fission, your ordinary concern for your own future can attach to someone who is not strictly you, to lefty or to righty or to both. From this, Parfit concluded that strict numerical identity may not be what matters. What matters, he said, is psychological continuity and connectedness, a relation he labelled simply Relation R. The slogan that crystallised it has echoed through philosophy ever since. Identity is not what matters. Hold that phrase at arm's length for a moment and present it exactly as Parfit intended, no more and no less. Reductionism is not the claim that you do not exist, or that your experiences are fake, or that nothing matters. Parfit was emphatic that ethics and prudence survive. The claim is narrower and stranger, that the single, indivisible self many people hope they are, a deep, further fact that remains strictly identical through every change, the soul-like core that is wholly you and could never be partly someone else, may simply not be there over and above the flowing physical and psychological continuities. In the four-dimensional picture, this lands with peculiar force. If you are a worm of temporal parts, then you is the name of a pattern, a thread of connections running along a world line, and the deep, unified self was a story the thread told about itself. Not everyone accepts this thinning out, and intellectual honesty requires naming the resistance, because it is serious. One major alternative is called animalism, defended by the philosopher Erik Olson in his 1997 book, The Human Animal: Personal Identity Without Psychology. Animalism says you are, quite literally, a biological organism, a living human animal, and that your persistence is the persistence of that organism, not of a psychological pattern that could, in principle, be copied, split, or uploaded. On this view, fission puzzles lose much of their bite, because organisms do not ordinarily divide that way, and what you are is settled by biology, not by the philosophy of memory. Animalism is a standing rebuke to the idea that the self is only a loose construction of mental stages. We will not adjudicate it here. We note it because the field is not unanimous, and the reductionist conclusion is a position within a live debate, not a finding stamped and certified. Behind all of this stands an older voice, and it is worth hearing because it frames the deflationary side perfectly. The 18th century philosopher David Hume, searching his own experience for the self, reported that he could never catch himself, as he put it, without a perception, never find the I as a separate item, but only ever the passing thoughts, sensations, and feelings themselves. The self, Hume suggested, does not show up in experience as a thing over and above the experiences. In the 20th century, the philosopher Daniel Dennett offered a modern version of the same deflation, describing the self as a center of narrative gravity, not a physical object you could locate, but a useful abstraction, like the center of gravity of an object, around which a story organizes itself. Present these neutrally. They are the strongest statements of the view that the self is a pattern rather than a substance. Whether a pattern is all you are is the question we are building toward. Step back from the imagined surgery for a moment, because the same conclusion can be reached without any scalpel at all, through a thought experiment that has haunted the field since Parfit pressed it: teletransportation. Imagine a machine on Earth that scans your body to the last atom, records the exact arrangement, and in the scanning destroys it, while the information races to Mars, where an assembler builds from fresh matter a perfect replica, molecule for molecule, carrying every memory, every intention, every half-finished thought you held as you stepped in. The replica wakes on Mars, certain that it is you, remembering Earth, resuming your plans. Is it you? Did you travel to Mars? Or did you die on Earth, while a stranger with your memories was born on another world? The reductionist answer is unsettling precisely because it is so calm. The question of strict identity may have no determinate answer, and, more importantly, it may not be the question that matters. What matters on this view is whether the relation Parfit named relation R holds, the right kind of psychological continuity and connectedness carried forward by any reliable cause. If relation R holds, then everything you ordinarily care about in survival is preserved, whether or not the metaphysical ledger says the person on Mars is numerically one and the same as the person who stepped in on Earth. Identity, Parfit insisted, is not what matters. Continuity is. Notice how naturally that marries the four-dimensional picture. If you are a worm of temporal parts, or a succession of stages, then the teletransporter has performed neither a miracle nor a murder. It has merely relocated the pattern, the way a song is the same song whether it is played on this instrument or that. Mind uploading, copying the pattern of a brain onto another substrate, becomes, on this view, not obviously different in kind from sleeping and waking, since in each case what persists is a pattern carried forward, rather than a substance ferried across. Let the machine build 2 replicas instead of 1, and you are back in Fission, with 2 equally good claimants and no fact to decide between them. The thread running through every one of these cases is the thread relativity first handed us, the self thinning from a substance into a structure, from a thing into a pattern, from a soul into a shape strung along a world line. It helps to give the rival pictures of time their technical names, because the vocabulary marks the battle lines for what follows. The view that there is a real, moving, privileged present, that now is an objective feature of the world that genuinely flows, is called the A theory of time. The view that there is no such moving present, that all times are equally real, and the only temporal facts are the tenseless relations of earlier than and later than, is called the B theory. Eternalism and the block universe are at home with the B theory, and the 4-dimensional temporal parts account of persons fits the B theory like a hand in a glove. Presentism is the natural ally of the A theory. So when physicists say relativity favors the block, what they are claiming in this vocabulary is that relativity pressures the A theory and props up the B theory, that the flowing now we feel so certainly has no place in the fundamental description. The resistance to that conclusion is more sophisticated than popular accounts admit, and fairness requires laying it out before we weigh anything. One strategy, defended by philosophers such as Dean Zimmerman, grants relativity every experimental triumph, while insisting that there is, in addition, a privileged way of slicing space-time into moments, what physicists call a foliation, a stacking of 3-dimensional sheets of simultaneity, one of which is metaphysically the present, even though no experiment can pick it out. This is the neo-Lorentzian move. It reproduces every prediction Einstein's theory makes, down to the last decimal of the GPS correction, while preserving a real, flowing now that simply happens to be undetectable. Critics reply that buying back the present with undetectable structure is a steep price, and that a present no instrument can find looks suspiciously like a present physics does not need. Defenders answer that experience itself, the relentless, universal sense that time passes, is data too, and that a theory which files the most pervasive feature of human experience under illusion has its own heavy bill to pay. Neither side has landed a knockout. The honest summary is the one the literature keeps returning to. Relativity constrains the metaphysics of time without fully determining it. Between the stark reductionism of the temporal parts view and the biological anchoring of animalism sits yet a third family, the constitution theorists, who hold that a person is constituted by an organism or a body without being identical to it, much as a statue is constituted by a lump of clay without being the very same thing as the lump, the exact puzzle we met a few minutes ago. On this view, you are more than an aggregate of stages and more than a mere animal. You are a person, a distinctive kind of entity with a first-person perspective, depending on the body the way the statue depends on the clay, yet not exhausted by it. The point of naming all of these, worm and stage, reductionist and animalist and constitution theorist, A-theorist and B-theorist, presentist and eternalist, is to see that you are just temporal parts is one option among several live, defended, competing positions. Not a verdict that physics or philosophy has handed down with a single voice. They agree on the physics. They divide on the meaning. And that division is precisely the clue we will follow when we stop presenting and begin to examine. But there is one argument that tries to end the division by force, to use the physics itself to settle the metaphysics in a single stroke. And it is time to give it its full and fair hearing. Now we must return to physics, because there is a single argument that fuses the relativity of Part 1 with the metaphysics we have just laid out. And it is the most provocative claim in the entire subject. In 1966, the physicist C.W. Rietdijk published a paper with a title that hides nothing: A Rigorous Proof of Determinism Derived from the Special Theory of Relativity. A year later, in 1967, the philosopher Rietdijk-Putnam published Time and Physical Geometry, arguing for the same conclusion from the same source. The structure of the argument is simple enough to follow in a single breath, which is exactly what makes it dangerous. Start with an event you call here and now on Earth. Whatever is real, you say, includes everything simultaneous with that event. Now introduce an observer moving relative to you, even slowly, far away. Because of the relativity of simultaneity, that observer's now, their slice of simultaneous events, is tilted relative to yours, and out at a great distance, a small tilt sweeps across an enormous span of time. Their slice of what is real now can include events that, from your frame, lie in the future. If what is simultaneous with a real event is itself real, and if reality is transitive, if the real things of a real thing are themselves real, then those future events are already real. Putnam stated the conclusion in 4 flat words: all future things are real. To make this vivid, the mathematical physicist Roger Penrose offered an illustration that has become famous as the Andromeda Paradox in his 1989 book, The Emperor's New Mind. Picture 2 people passing each other on a sidewalk, strolling in opposite directions at an ordinary walking pace. Overhead, unimaginably far away, lies the Andromeda Galaxy, about 2.5 million light-years distant. So far that its light takes 2.5 million years to reach us, and we see it tonight as it was before our species existed. Now apply the relativity of simultaneity. The shift in simultaneous time at a distance is given, to good approximation, by a compact formula. Delta t is approximately equal to v times L over c squared, the relative velocity times the distance divided by the speed of light squared. Plug in a walking speed difference of about 4 kilometers per hour and Andromeda's distance, and the 2 pedestrian slices of now at Andromeda differ by roughly 3.5 days. One walker's present moment at Andromeda includes events that, for the other walker passing in the opposite direction, have not yet happened. If a fleet were launching from Andromeda toward Earth, one pedestrian's now might contain the launch already decided and underway, while the other's now contains a council still debating whether to go. Same sidewalk, same instant of passing, different presents, separated by days, simply because they walk in opposite directions. What does it mean that the direction of an evening stroll can shuffle, by days, which distant events count as already real? Taken at face value, it seems to say the future is not open at all, that it is simply elsewhere, fixed and waiting, and our sense of an unmade tomorrow is a local illusion of beings trapped reading from one thin slice. That is the conclusion Rietdijk and Putnam drew, and it is the conclusion many popular accounts repeat as though it were a settled theorem of physics. But it is not a settled theorem, and the neutral presentation requires that we say so clearly, while saving the full weighing for later. Almost as soon as the argument appeared, careful readers identified hidden premises doing the heavy lifting. In 1968, the philosopher of physics Howard Stein published a pointed response, and a tradition of analysis after him, sharpened in our own time by the historian and philosopher of physics John Norton, located exactly where the argument quietly adds to the physics. Relativity, these critics observe, tells you about simultaneity. It says not one word by itself about reality or determinateness. The argument assumes that being simultaneous with a real event makes something real, and it assumes that this reality relation chains transitively from observer to observer to observer. Neither assumption is part of relativity. They are metaphysical bridge principles, smuggled in alongside the geometry. Strip them out, and what relativity establishes is the modest, secure claim of Part 1. there is no universal now, not the sweeping claim that the future is already laid down in full. Others go further still, defending a neo-Lorentzian view with a hidden preferred frame that reproduces every experimental prediction of relativity while preserving a real, if undetectable, present. These views are not mainstream in physics, but they are not refuted by any experiment either. We will return in the final part of this investigation to weigh which side the evidence actually favours. For now, plant the flag. The geometry is secure. The grand ontological conclusion is contested. There is one more frontier to survey before we turn from presentation to prosecution, and it is the deepest water of all. When physicists try to unite relativity with quantum mechanics to build a theory of quantum gravity, time itself begins to misbehave in the equations. In several leading approaches, the fundamental equation takes a form written as h psi equals 0, in which the term that would ordinarily generate change over time simply vanishes. The mathematics seems to describe a universe with no built-in evolution, no ticking, no flow, a frozen totality. Some physicists, most famously Julian Barbour, have taken this at face value and argued that time, at the deepest level, may be an illusion. Others insist the formalism has been misread, or that time re-emerges once you ask the right questions about what observers inside the universe actually measure. The subject is so far from experimental test that the physicist Yoichiro Nambu once wryly called quantum gravity research postmodern physics, theory unconstrained, for now, by data. It would be dishonest to present the unreality of time as a discovery. It is, at most, a contested interpretation at the frontier of an unfinished theory. And running beneath all of it is a stubborn fact that no static picture has fully explained: the arrow of time. Heat flows from hot to cold and never spontaneously back. Records and memories point to the past, never the future. You remember yesterday and anticipate tomorrow, never the reverse. A purely four-dimensional block in which all moments are equally real and nothing privileges one direction does not by itself say why creatures within it experience such a relentless one-way current, why life is lived forward with urgency and loss if the whole is simply laid out and finished. The geometry is silent on the thing we feel most certainly of all. So here is where the neutral presentation leaves us, with the foundations fully laid and not one claim yet challenged. Physics has dissolved the universal present. Metaphysics offers a four-dimensional account of persistence in which persons are worms or stages built of temporal parts. A famous argument runs from relativity to the conclusion that the future is already real, though its hidden premises are contested. A reductionist tradition concludes that the deep, indivisible self may not exist, and that identity is not what matters, though serious alternatives stand against it. And the frontier of physics flirts with the idea that time is unreal, while the arrow of time stubbornly insists otherwise. Threaded through every one of these is a single thing the physics keeps not explaining. The seed we have planted again and again and will finally harvest. The geometry can chart the world line, slice it, label its parts, and relate them. But it never says why there is a single someone who experiences that world line from the inside. Why a stack of separate slices should feel, from within, like one life with one subject living it. Keep that question close. In the final part of this exploration, we stop presenting and we begin to examine. We ask what these claims actually prove, where they quietly overreach, and what the evidence, followed honestly all the way down, really points toward. For the past 2 parts, I have presented and I have not prosecuted. I laid out the relativity of simultaneity, the 4-dimensional fabric of Minkowski, the world lines and light cones, and the invariant interval. I laid out endurantism and perdurantism, worm theory and stage theory, the problem of temporary intrinsics, the statue and the clay, the fission of the self, Parfit's reductionism, Hume's bundle, Dennett's pattern. I gave the Rietdijk-Putnam argument its strongest voice and let it conclude that the future is already real. I debunked nothing. That was deliberate. Now we examine. Now we ask what these claims actually prove and where exactly they stop being physics and start being something else, wearing the borrowed authority of physics. Begin with the distinction that the whole investigation has been quietly sharpening, because everything turns on it. There is what relativity firmly establishes, and there is what is built on top of relativity. What relativity firmly establishes is this: there is no observer-independent, universal slice of now stretching across all of space. That claim is secure. It is confirmed in atomic clocks flown on aircraft, in the hydrogen maser of gravity probe A, in the 38 microseconds a day that keep the satellites overhead honest. I do not dispute 1 decimal of it. But notice what that claim is about. It is about simultaneity, about clocks, signals, and the order of distant events. It is not, by itself, about whether you have a soul. It is not about whether your tomorrow is open. It is not about whether an intelligent cause stands behind the fabric. Those are further claims. And the entire anti-theistic reading of the block universe consists in treating the further claims as though they were included in the first. Consider the first and broadest of those claims, stated in its strongest form, the way its defenders would want it stated. The claim is, the block universe is the true picture of reality. In it, all events simply exist, tenselessly, with no passage and no privileged present. Therefore, there is no enduring self moving through time, no soul, and no need for any creator. The universe is just a finished 4-dimensional shape, and we are featureless ripples within it. That is the argument at full strength. Now examine it. Grant, for the sake of argument, the entire physical picture. Grant the block. Does all events exist tenselessly at their space-time addresses entail no immaterial soul exists or no intelligent cause exists? Trace the inference. There is no logical road from the one to the other. The geometry describes the arrangement of events. It says nothing whatsoever about whether that arrangement was caused or whether conscious subjects within it are purely material. The conclusion does not follow from the premise. It has been placed beside the premise and asserted to follow. That is not a proof. It is a non sequitur in a lab coat. And here is where the examination becomes an inversion. Because the block universe, looked at honestly, is not the enemy of an intelligent cause, it is its oldest image. For centuries before Minkowski drew a single light cone, those who reasoned toward a first cause described that cause in a very particular way, as eternal, uncaused, existing outside of time, not waiting inside the flow of moments, but beholding the whole of time at once. To such a cause, past and future are not gone and not yet. They are simply present, all of them, the way every page of a finished book is present to its author, though the characters inside read it one line at a time. Look again at what the block universe says. It says that past, present, and future all exist, that the whole of time is laid out as a single reality, that the moving now is only the limited vantage of a being reading from inside. The atheist who triumphantly unrolls the block has, without intending to, drawn a picture of the universe as seen from eternity, the very vantage that classical theism always assigned to the Creator and to no one else. The block does not abolish the timeless God. It is the shadow such a God casts in geometry. What the block universe cannot supply from within itself is the one thing the materialist most needs and least notices: the conscious I for whom the world line is a life. Hold that, we are coming back to it, because it is the center of everything. What does it mean that the strongest scientific picture of time turns out to resemble, almost feature for feature, the view from eternity that theologians described from reason alone? At minimum, it means the block is no weapon against an intelligent cause. At most, it is a clue. Turn now to the second claim, the one that frightens people most, drawn from the Rietdijk-Putnam argument. The claim is, relativity proves the future already exists, fixed and complete. Therefore, the open future is an illusion. Free will is impossible, and your sense of deciding anything is a trick of the slice you happen to inhabit. Give it its strongest hearing. It is a serious argument advanced by serious people. Now examine it, and recall what we already established in the neutral presentation, on the testimony of the argument's own most careful readers. The Rietdijk-Putnam argument is not a theorem of relativity. It requires two extra premises that relativity does not contain. First, that whatever is simultaneous with something real is itself real. And second, that this reality relation chains transitively from one moving observer to the next. Relativity says nothing about reality or determinateness. It speaks only of simultaneity. The philosopher of physics John Norton put the diagnosis precisely. The determinateness in the argument is supplied by us externally. It is added by the arguer, not read from the physics. And he offered an image that dismantles the whole inference. Drawing a four-dimensional diagram, he observed, no more proves that the future is already real than the square on tomorrow's page of a diary proves that tomorrow has already happened. The page exists, the day does not. Not yet. The diagram is a representation, not a resurrection. So the second claim fails on its own terms, by the admission of the physicists and philosophers who examined it most closely. But suppose someone digs in and insists, very well, perhaps the block is real and the future genuinely is laid out. Does even that abolish freedom and banish the Creator? Watch the logic carefully, because the materialist has handed the theist a gift without realizing it. Fixed is not the same as uncaused. A future that is fully laid out, every event in its place from one end of the block to the other, is not a future that explains itself. A determinate arrangement raises, with more urgency rather than less, the question, what set this configuration? Why this block and not another? Picture an immense mural, finished wall to wall, every figure already painted, nothing left to add. That the mural is complete does not mean it had no painter. If anything, a complete and ordered whole points more insistently to a source than a half-finished sketch would. The skeptic reaches for the fixity of the block to crush human freedom into illusion, and in the same motion describes a cosmos whose every cross-section was set in a single act. That is not the signature of blind accident. A whole, ordered from beginning to end, configured all at once, is far closer to what the word decree has always meant than to what the word chance could ever mean. The argument meant to retire the Creator instead sketches his handwriting across the whole of time. And there is a deeper trouble with the claim that passage is mere illusion, a trouble that turns the argument against itself. Follow it as a reductio. Suppose temporal becoming is wholly unreal. Suppose there is no genuine first this, then that, only a static block we mislabel with the language of flow. Now notice what you just did to understand that sentence. You held the premises in mind, and then you moved to the conclusion. You followed an argument. And following an argument is itself a temporal act, a passage from before I saw the point to now I see it. Reasoning is the movement of a mind from premise to inference to conclusion. An argument whose conclusion is there is no real before and after in lived experience must be followed through a real before and after in order to be believed at all. It saws off the branch it is sitting on. You cannot reason your way to the unreality of the very sequence that reasoning is made of. The experience of passage is not a stray illusion to be explained away. It is the precondition of explaining anything. Which brings us to the third claim and the heart of the matter. The claim about you. It is the strongest of the anti-theistic readings, and it deserves the fullest hearing. The claim is, the self is nothing over and above its parts. On the physics side, you are a worm of temporal slices in the block. On the philosophy side, you are a bundle of perceptions, as Hume said, or a centre of narrative gravity, as Dennett said, or a chain of psychological connections that is not even what matters, as Parfit said. There is no unified, enduring I. The soul is a story the brain tells. Present it at full strength, because it is genuinely formidable, and because honest people have been moved by it. Now examine it with care, and ask the simplest possible question. What has this picture actually explained? It has explained how the slices relate by continuity, by overlapping memory, by causal connection along the world line. It has given an account of persistence, of how the part at one time hangs together with the part at another. Grant all of that. But persistence was never the hard question. The hard question, the one the research itself flagged as the explanatory remainder that physics keeps not reaching, is why there is a single someone for whom all those slices are mine. Why is there one point of view, one experiencer, one subject, for whom the world line is lived from the inside, rather than merely charted from the outside? Slice a film into its frames, and you have explained the strip. Every frame, every transition, the whole physical reel. You have said nothing at all about the one watching the film, the single awareness, for whom the frames become a story. The temporal parts theory is a complete account of the strip, and a total silence about the viewer. This is the consciousness argument, and on this topic it cuts deepest, because the four-dimensional picture does not soften the problem of consciousness, it sharpens it to a point. The materialist already owes us an answer to how unconscious matter, atoms with no awareness, no inner light, gives rise to subjective experience at all. That is the famous hard problem, and it remains unsolved by the admission of the neuroscientists who work on it. But the block universe doubles the debt. Now you must explain not merely how unconscious matter becomes a mind, but how a succession of distinct, momentary, mutually external slices, each one as mindless as a frame of film, becomes one continuous experiencer who binds them into a single life. No slice is conscious. The relations between slices are not conscious. And yet, here is the undeniable datum, the thing more certain to you than any equation. There is one of you reading this now, gathering these very words into a single understanding. Where, in a stack of unconscious parts, did the one who gathers them come from? Hear how the deflationary answers consume themselves when pressed. Hume reports that he searched his experience and could never catch the self. Only ever a perception, never the I. But consider who is doing the searching, the looking, the catching, the failing to find. These are acts, and acts have an agent. The very introspection that fails to locate the self is performed by the self it cannot locate. Hume's bundle needs something to bundle it, a unity in which the perceptions are gathered as mine. And that unity is precisely what the bundle theory cannot find inside the bundle, because it is doing the looking. And Dennett's elegant phrase, the center of narrative gravity, examine it as a reductio. A center of gravity is an abstraction, a useful fiction with no independent existence. Fine. But a narrative is told, and an illusion is suffered, and a fiction is entertained. And all of those words require a someone to whom the telling appears, for whom the fiction seems unified. To call the self an illusion is to say there is an appearance of a self presented to no one. An illusion with no one deceived is not an illusion. It is a contradiction. The claim that the unified subject is a fiction can only be asserted by the unified subject it denies. The argument refutes itself in the act of being made. What does it mean that every attempt to dissolve the self must be carried out by the self it is trying to dissolve? It means we have struck something that does not reduce. The unified first-person subject, the one who experiences the world line as one life, who follows the argument, who searches and fails to find itself precisely because it is the seeker, is not just another item in the block to be sliced and relabeled. It is the explanatory remainder that the whole materialist apparatus, four-dimensional or not, leaves untouched. And an arrangement of unconscious matter that cannot in principle produce a unified conscious subject points beyond matter for the source of that subject. The thing we have been circling since the first minute of this video, the thing the geometry could chart but never explain, has a traditional name. The unity of consciousness that gathers many parts into one experienced life, and that no arrangement of mindless parts can manufacture, is what has always been meant by the soul. And a soul, an immaterial, unifying subject, is not the kind of thing unconscious particles assemble by accident. It is the kind of thing that must be given by a cause that is itself conscious, unified, and not made of parts. Let the cascade settle, because the three claims fall in sequence, and each fall tightens the next. The block universe does not disprove an intelligent cause. It portrays the timeless vantage such a cause was always said to occupy. The fixed future does not abolish agency or explain itself. It presents a whole ordered cosmos that demands a configurer and reads more like decree than accident. And the temporal part self does not eliminate the soul. It throws the unified conscious subject into sharper relief than ever, as the one reality in this entire investigation that cannot be built from the parts. Three extrapolations, each reaching past what the physics permits, each collapsing back when the hidden premise is exposed. I want to be fair to the honest impulse behind the materialist project, because some who hold it are sincere seekers, and the tone here is reserved for the arguments, never the people. The impulse says, give science time, and it will close these gaps. The soul and the creator are placeholders for ignorance that the next theory will dispel. But listen to what the relevant sciences say about themselves in their own voices. Norton says the determinateness was supplied by us, not by the physics. The literature on quantum gravity, where some hope time itself will be explained away, is so far from any experiment that a Nobel laureate called it postmodern physics, theory adrift from data. The hard problem of consciousness sits exactly where it sat a century ago. The promissory note keeps being written and never cashed. And a confidence that outruns its own evidence by the evidence's own admission is not science. It is faith. Faith pointed away from the conclusion the evidence actually favours. The honest position is not that science has shown there is no soul and no God. It is that the physics shows a magnificent, ordered, four-dimensional fabric. The philosophy shows a self that will not reduce to its parts. And both, followed without flinching, point past themselves to a cause that is eternal, intelligent, unified, and outside of time. Before I close, take the moment this subject asks for. Set down for a breath the question of who is right, and sit with what is not in dispute. You are reading these words as one person, not as a committee of slices, not as a bundle with no binder, as one undivided awareness, gathering a sentence into a meaning, aware that it is you and no one else who is doing it. That unity is the most immediate fact you possess, more immediate than the chair beneath you or the light in the room. Every theory we have examined had to borrow it even to be stated. Ask yourself honestly, is that unified I the sort of thing a stack of mindless moments could ever add up to? Or is it the sort of thing that must come from a source already conscious and already one? Let me bring this exploration to a close. We began with a galaxy 2.5 million light-years away and a now that bends with the pace of a walk. We followed special relativity to the loss of the universal present, Minkowski to the four-dimensional block, and the invariant interval beneath the shifting shadows of space and time. We traced persistence through endurantism and perdurantism, worm theory and stage theory, the statue and the clay, the fission of the self, and Parfit's verdict that identity is not what matters. We let the Rietdijk-Putnam argument declare the future already real, and the Andromeda Paradox make it vivid. And then we examined and found that at every turn, the physics established something precise and modest, while the sweeping conclusions about the soul, about freedom, about God, were added afterward and could not bear the weight placed on them. The block universe does not erase the Creator. It images his timeless vantage. The fixed future does not abolish the decree. It spells it across the whole of time. The temporal parts self does not abolish the soul. It reveals the unified subject as the one thing that cannot be assembled from parts, and so must be given by a cause that is conscious, eternal, and one. The geometry was settled long before the metaphysics, and the metaphysics, followed honestly, does not lead to emptiness. It leads to an intelligent cause. If you found value in this exploration, consider subscribing. It helps these deep dives reach more curious minds. You are not a stack of slices that time happens to have left lying in a row. You are the one for whom the slices became a life, a single awareness, reading from inside a fabric whose whole, the one outside of time, beholds at once. The block may be laid out end to end, but the you that experiences it was never just a part of it. Sleep well tonight, knowing that the self you cannot find by looking is the very thing that is doing the looking, and that it was given, not assembled. Good night.